Chapter 2. A huge red transport truck stood in front of the little roadside restaurant. The vertical exhaust pipe muttered softly, and an almost invisible haze of steel blue smoke hovered over its end. It was a new truck, shining red, and its 12-inch letters on its sides. Oklahoma City Transport Company. Its double tires were new, and a brass padlock stood straight out from the hasp on the big black doors. Inside the screen restaurant, a radio played, quiet dance music turned low the way it is when no one is listening. A small outlet fan turned silently in its circular hole over the entrance, and flies buzzed excitedly about the doors and windows, butting the screens. Inside, one man, the truck driver, sat on a stool and rested his elbows on the counter and looked over his coffee at the lean, lonely waitress. He talked the smart, listless language of the roadsides to her. "I seen him about 3 months ago. He had an operation. Cut something out. I forgot what." And she, "Doesn't seem no longer than a week I seen him myself. Looked fine then. He's a nice sort of guy when he ain't stinko." Now and then the flies roared softly at the screen door. The coffee machine spurted steam, and the waitress, without looking, reached behind her and shut it off. Outside, a man walking along the edge of the highway crossed over and approached the truck. He walked slowly to the front of it, put his hand on the shiny fender, and looked at the no rider sticker on the windshield. For a minute he was about to walk on down the road, but instead he sat on the running board on the side away from the restaurant. He was not over 30. His eyes were very dark brown, and there was a hint of brown pigment in his eyeballs. His cheekbones were high and wide, and strong, deep lines cut down his cheeks in curves beside his mouth. His upper lip was long, and since his teeth protruded, the lips stretched to cover them, for this man had kept his lips closed. His hands were hard, with broad fingers and nails as thick and ridged as little clamshells. The space between his thumb and forefinger and the hams of his hands were shiny with callus. The man's clothes were new, all of them, cheap and new. His gray cap was so new that the visor was still stiff and the buttons still on, not shapeless and bulged as it would be when it had served for a while all the various purposes of a cap, carrying sack, towel, handkerchief. His suit was of cheap gray hardcloth, and so new that there were creases in the trousers. His blue chambray hat shirt was stiff and smooth with filler. The coat was too big, the trousers too short, for he was a tall man. The coat shoulder peaks hung down on his arms, and even then the sleeves were too short, and the front of the coat flapped loosely over his stomach. He wore a pair of new tan shoes of the kind called army last, hobnailed and with half circles like horseshoes to protect the edges of the heels from wear. This man sat on the running board and took off his cap and mopped his face with it. Then he put on the cap, and by pulling started the future ruin of the visor. His feet caught his attention. He leaned down and loosened the shoelaces, and did not tie the ends again. Over his head, the exhaust of the diesel engine whispered in quick puffs of blue smoke. The music stopped in the restaurant, and a man's voice spoke from the loudspeaker, but the waitress did not turn him off, for she didn't know that the music had stopped. Her exploring fingers found a lump under her ear. She was trying to see it in a mirror behind the counter without letting the truck driver know, and so she pretended to push a bit of hair to neatness. The truck driver said, "There was a big dance in Shawnee. I heard somebody got killed or something. You hear anything?" "No," said the waitress, and she lovingly fingered the lump under her ear. Outside, the seated man stood up and looked over the cowl of the truck and watched the restaurant for a moment. Then he settled back on the running board, pulled a sack of tobacco and a book of papers from his side pocket. He rolled a cigarette slowly and perfectly, studied it, smoothed it. At last he lighted it and pushed the burning match into the dust at his feet. The sun cut into the shade of the truck as noon approached. In the restaurant, the truck The truck driver paid his bill and put 2 nickels change in a slot machine. The whirling cylinders gave him no score. "They fix 'em so you can't win nothing," he said to the waitress, and she replied, "Guy took the jackpot not 2 hours ago. $3.80 he got. How soon you gonna be back by?" He held the screen door a little open. "Week, 10 days," he said. "Gotta make a run to Tulsa, and I never get back soon as I think." She said crossly, "Don't let the flies in. Either go out or come in." "So long," he said, and he pushed his way out. The screen door banged behind him. He stood in the sun, peeling the wrapper of a piece of gum. He was a heavy man, broad in the shoulders, thick in the stomach. His face was red, and his blue eyes long and slitted from having squinted always at the sharp light. He wore army trousers and high-laced boots. Holding the stick of gum in front of his lips, he called through the screen, "Well, don't do nothing you don't want me to hear about." The waitress was turned toward a mirror on the back wall. She grunted a reply. The truck driver gnawed down the stick of gum slowly, opening his jaws and lips wide with each bite. He shaped the gum in his mouth, rolled it under his tongue, while he walked to the big red truck. The hitchhiker stood up and looked across through the windows. "Could you give me a lift, mister?" The driver looked quickly back at the restaurant for a second. "Didn't you see the no rider sticker on the windshield?" "Sure, I seen it. But sometimes a guy'll be a good guy even if some rich bastard makes him carry a sticker." The driver, getting slowly into the truck, considered the parts of this answer. If he refused now, not only was he not a good guy, but he was forced to carry a sticker, was not allowed to have company. If he took in the hitchhiker, he was automatically a good guy, and also he was not one whom any rich bastard could kick around. He knew he was being trapped, but he couldn't see a way out, and he wanted to be a good guy. He glanced at the restaurant. "Scrunch down on the running board till we get around the bend," he said. The hitchhiker flopped down out of sight and clung to the door handle. The motor roared up for a moment. The gears clicked in, and the great truck moved away. First gear, second gear, third gear, and then a high whining pickup in fourth gear. Under the clinging man, the highway blurred dizzily by. It was a mile to the first turn in the road. Then the truck slowed down. The hitchhiker stood up, eased the door open, and slipped into the seat. The driver looked over at him, slitting his eyes, and he chewed, as though thoughts and impressions were being sorted and arranged by his jaws before they were finally filed away in his brain. His eyes began at the new cap, moved down to the new clothes, to new shoes. The hitchhiker squirmed his back against the seat in comfort, took off his cap, and swabbed his sweating forehead and chin with it. "Thanks, buddy," he said. "My dogs was pooped out." "New shoes," said the driver. His voice had the same quality of secrecy and insinuation his eyes had. "You oughtn't to take no walk in new shoes. Hot weather." The hiker looked down at the dusty yellow shoes. "Didn't have no other shoes," he said. "Guy got to wear 'em if he got no others." The driver squinted judiciously ahead and built up the speed of the truck a little. "Going far?" "Uh-uh. I'd have walked with her if my dogs wasn't pooped out." The questions of the driver had the tone of a subtle examination. He seemed to spread nets, to set traps with his questions. "Looking for a job?" he asked. "No, my old man's got a place. 40 acres. He's a cropper, but we've been there a long time." The driver looked significantly at the fields along the road where the corn was fallen sideways, and the dust was piled on it. Little flints shoved through the dusty soil. The driver said, as though to himself, "A 40-acre cropper and he ain't been dusted out, and he ain't been tractored out?" "Course, I ain't heard lately," said the hitchhiker. "Long time," said the driver. A bee flew into the cab and buzzed in the back of the windshield. The driver put out his hand and carefully drove the bee into an airstream and blew it out of the window. "Cropper's going fast now," he said. "One cat takes and shoves 10 families out. Cats all over hell now. Tear in and shove the croppers out. How's your old man hold on?" His tongue and his jaws became busy with the neglected gum, turned it and chewed it. With each opening of his mouth, his tongue could be seen flipping gum over. "Well, I ain't heard lately. I was never no hand to write. nor my old man neither, he added quickly. But the both of us can, if we want. Been doing a job? Again, the secret investigating casualness. He looked out over the field at the shimmering air, and gathering his gum in his cheek out of the way, he spat out the window. Sure have, said the hitchhiker. Thought so. I seen your hands. Been swinging a pick or an axe or a sledge. That shines up your hands. I notice all stuff like that. Take pride in it. The hitchhiker stared at him. The truck tires sang on the road. Like to know anything else? I'll tell you. You ain't got to guess. Now, don't get sore. I wasn't getting nosy. I'll tell you anything. I ain't hiding nothing. Now, don't get sore. I just like to notice things. Makes the time pass. I'll tell you anything. Name's Jode. Tom Jode. Old man is old Tom Jode. His eyes rested broodingly on the driver. Don't get sore. I didn't mean nothing. I don't mean nothing neither, said Jode. I'm just trying to get along without shoving nobody around. He stopped and looked out at the dry fields, at the starved tree clumps hanging uneasily in the heated distance. From his side pocket he brought out his tobacco and papers. He rolled his cigarette down between his knees, where the wind could not get at it. The driver chewed as rhythmically, as thoughtfully as a cow. He waited to let the whole emphasis of the preceding passage disappear and be forgotten. At last, when the air seemed neutral again, he said, "A guy that never been a truck skinner don't know nothing what it's like. Owners don't want us to pick up nobody. So we got to sit here and just skinner along, lest we want to take a chance at getting fired like I just done with you." "Appreciate it," said Jode. "I've knew guys that done screwy things while they're driving trucks. I remember a guy used to make up poetry. It passed the time." He looked over secretly to see whether Jode was interested or amazed. Jode was silent, looking into the distance ahead, along the white road that waved gently, like a groundswell. The driver went on at last. "I remember a piece of poetry this here guy wrote down. It was about him and a couple of other guys going all over the world, drinking and raising hell, and screwing around. I wished I could remember how that piece went. This guy had words in it that Jesus H. Christ wouldn't know what they meant. Part was like this. And there we spied with a trigger that was bigger than an elephant's proboscis, or the wanger of a whale. That proboscis is a nose leg. With an elephant, it's his trunk. Guy showed me a dictionary. Carried that dictionary all over hell with him. He'd look in it while he pulled up, getting his pie and coffee. He stopped, feeling lonely in the long speech. His secret eyes turned on his passenger. Jode remained silent. Nervously, the driver tried to force him into participation. Ever know a guy that said big words like that? Preacher, said Jode. Well, it makes you mad to hear a guy use big words. Of course, with a preacher, it's all right, because nobody would fool around with a preacher anyways. But this guy was funny. You didn't give a damn when he said the big word, 'cause he just done it for ducks. He wasn't putting on no dog. The driver was reassured. He knew at least Jode was listening. He swung the great truck viciously around a bend, and the tires shrilled. Like I was saying, he continued, guy that drives a truck does screwy things. He got to. He'd go nuts just sitting here, and the road sneaking under the wheels. Fellas says once that truck skinners eats all the time, in hamburger joints along the road. Sure seems to live there, Jode agreed. Sure, they stop, but it ain't to eat. They ain't hardly ever hungry. They're just goddamn sick of going. Get sick of it. Joints is the only place you can pull up, and when you stop, you got to buy something so you can sling the bull with the broad behind the counter. So you get a cup of coffee and a piece of pie. Kinda gives the guy a little rest. He chewed his gum slowly and turned it with his tongue. Must be tough, said Jode with no emphasis. The driver glanced quickly at him, looking for satire. Well, it ain't no goddamn cinch, he said testily. Looks easy, just sitting here till you put in your 8 or maybe your 10 or 14 hours. But the road gets into a guy. You got to do something. Some sings and some whistles. Company won't let us have no radio. A few takes a pint along, but them kind don't stick along, he said, the last smugly. I don't never take a drink till I'm through. Yeah? Jode asked. Yeah. A guy got to get ahead. Why, I'm thinking of taking one of them correspondence school courses. Mechanical engineering. It's easy. Just study a few or easy lessons at home. I'm thinking of it. Then I won't drive no truck. Then I'll tell other guys to drive trucks. Joe took a pint of whiskey from his side coat pocket. Sure you won't have a snort? His voice was teasing. No, by God. I won't touch it. A guy can't drink liquor all the time and study like I'm going to. Joe uncorked the bottle, took 2 quick swallows, recorked it, and put it back in his pocket. The spicy hot smell of the whiskey filled the cab. You're all wound up, said Joe. What's the matter? Got a girl? Well, sure, but I want to get ahead anyway. I've been training my mind for a hell of a long time. The whiskey seemed to loosen Joe up. He rolled another cigarette and lighted it. I ain't got a hell of a lot further to go, he said. The driver went on quickly. I don't need no shot, he said. I train my mind all the time. I took a course in that 2 years ago. He patted the steering wheel with his right hand. Suppose I pass a guy on the road. I look at him, and after I passed, I try to remember everything about him. Kind of clothes, and shoes, and hat, and how he walked, and maybe how tall and what weight, and any scars. I do it pretty good. I can just make a whole picture in my head. Sometimes I think I ought to take a course to be a fingerprint expert. You'd be surprised how much a guy can remember. Joe took a quick drink from the flask. He dragged the last smoke from his raveling cigarette, and then, with calloused thumb and forefinger, crushed out the glowing end. He rubbed the butt into a pool and put it out the window, letting the breeze suck it from his fingers. The big tires sang a high note on the pavement. Joe's dark, quiet eyes became amused as he stared along the road. The driver waited and glanced uneasily over. At last, Joe's long upper lip grinned up from his teeth, and he chuckled silently. His chest jerked with the chuckles. You sure took a hell of a long time to get to it, buddy. The driver did not look over. Get to what? How do you mean? Joe's lips stretched tight over his long teeth for a moment, and he licked his lips. Like a dog, 2 licks, one in each direction from the middle. His voice became harsh. You know what I mean. You gave me a going over when I first got in. I seen you. The driver looked straight ahead, gripped the wheel so tightly that the pads of his palms bulged, and the backs of his hands paled. Joe continued. You know where I come from. The driver was silent. Don't you? Joe insisted. Well, sure. That is, maybe. But it ain't none of my business. I mind my own yard. It ain't nothing to me. The words tumbled out now. I don't stick my nose in nobody's business. And suddenly he was silent and waiting, and his hands were still white on the wheel. A grasshopper flipped through the window and lighted on the top of the instrument panel, where it sat and began to scrape its wings with its angled, jumping legs. Joe reached forward and crushed its hard skull-like head with his fingers, and he let it into the windstream out the window. Joe chuckled again while he brushed the bits of broken insect from his fingers. You got me wrong, mister, he said. I ain't keeping quiet about it. Sure, I've been in McAllister. Been there 4 years. Sure, these clothes they give me when I come out. But I don't give a damn who knows it. And I'm going to my old man's place, so I don't have to lie to get a job. The driver said, Well, that ain't none of my business. I ain't a nose you got. The hell you ain't, said Joe. That big old nose of yours is sticking out 8 miles ahead of your face. You had that big nose going over me like a sheep in a vegetable patch. The driver's face tightened. You got me all wrong, he began weakly. Joe laughed at him. You been a good guy. You give me a lift. Well, hell, I done time. So what? You want to know what I done time for, don't you? That ain't none of my affair. Nothing ain't none of your affair except skinning this here bull bitch long, and that's the least thing you work at. Now look, see that road up ahead? Yeah? Well, I get off there. Sure, I know you're wetting your pants to know what I done. I ain't the guy to let you down. The high hum of the motor dulled, and the song of the tires dropped in pitch. Joe got out his pint and took another short drink. The truck drifted to a stop where a dirt road opened at right angles to the highway. Joe got out and stood beside the cab window. The vertical exhaust pipe puttered up its barely visible blue smoke. Joe leaned toward the driver. Homicide, he said quickly. That's a big word. Means I killed the guy. 7 years. I'm sprung in 4 for keeping my nose clean. The driver's eyes slipped over Joe's face to memorize it. I never asked you nothing about it, he said. I mind my own yard. You can tell about it and every joint from here to Texola, he smiled. So long, fella. You've been a good guy. But look, when you been in stir a little while, you can smell a question coming from the hell to breakfast. You telegraph yours the first time you opened your trap. He spatted the metal door with the palm of his hand. Thanks for the lift, he said. So long. He turned away and walked into the dirt road. For a moment the driver stared after him, and then he called, Luck! Joe waved his hand without looking around. The motor roared up, and the gears clicked, and the great red truck rolled heavily away.